All right, hello. I'd like to introduce Zach Zlotnick. He's going to be talking about the mental impact of tech interviews. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much for that introduction. And I just wanted to give a shout out to all the hardworking volunteers and staff from Code and Supply who make this conference possible. They've done such an excellent job with this, and I'm just humbled. I'm in complete awe of what it is that they do. And I'm also humbled to stand here before you and speak today. So without further ado, my name is Zach Zlotnick. By day, I'm a software engineer at IBM Watson, and on the weekends, I enjoy autocross. And if that interests you, come find me in the hallway so we can nerd out about cars afterwards. For you live tweeters, that's my Twitter handle there. And we use this hashtag here, AbstractionsCon. Before we get started, I need to point out that these are my views. They're not my employer's. So on and so forth, lawyer cats, that type of thing. Also, I need to present that there is a content warning. While the content and language that I intend to use today will be family friendly, I acknowledge that some people may have some strong feelings about mental health, tech interviews, emotions, traumas, things like that. And really, if you just need to step out at any time, do what you got to do. There's no judgment here, none whatsoever. This is a link and a QR code for my slides. There's links scattered throughout, and I will show this again at the very end. So if you miss it here, you will see it again. There's links and everything scattered throughout there, and I just want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to view those. That's all. Especially the folks in the back that may not be able to see those links from here, and some of them are quite long, so yeah. Okay, so this talk is going to discuss what is broken with current tech interview processes. We're going to provide a little bit of background on mental health, imposter syndrome, discuss the intersection between those, and finally we're going to conclude with some steps that both companies and job seekers can take to improve this process. And so it begins with this. How many times have we heard this? That it's always worth a conversation, right? Whenever a recruiter contacts you, you think that, okay, yes, it is, people think that it's always worth that conversation, but is it? And the reason I ask this question is because interviews have a cost in terms of vacation time, childcare costs if you have a child, pet care costs if you have dogs like I do, time to prepare for interviews, and we'll talk a little bit about that, travel time, and of course, post-interview decompression and recovery. And that last one's important because that bird's hilarious. Because job interviews are universally stressful, and it's not just tech where this is a problem. It's a problem everywhere. Manufacturing, finance, accounting. It's a universal problem, and we all know, and we've all kind of internalized that coding interviews are broken. And we're going to unpack that a little bit further. And I know it sounds obvious, but there is some element of truth to that. And so mental health is becoming a growing concern amongst folks in the tech community, and this is evidenced by groups such as Open Sourcing Mental Illness, the fact that there's a mental health channel in pretty much every Slack group that I'm in, including Code and Supply. But it also points to a new willingness to talk about some of these things in light of some of the stigmas that exist around mental health. And so we begin our discussion of this. My clicker's being kind of funny. We begin our discussion with this about the dreaded coding interview. And so I'm sure that there are some people in here that don't quite know what that is, so I'll briefly describe what that is. And the short version is, my clicker's being kind of funny. It's basically a timed assessment where a prospective employee solves a problem, like usually on a whiteboard or via some other medium like a shared text editor. In some cases, the candidate and the interviewer can be on opposite sides of the country or even the globe. But despite the medium, the process is exactly the same, where you are expected to complete a pet problem in a small amount of time, usually with an audience, sometimes called whiteboarding, sometimes live coding. I'm going to use both of those terms kind of interchangeably here. And so the next question is, why do we do these? Why is there so much emphasis on these things? And essentially, companies want to make sure that people can do the job that they're being hired to do. And on the surface, that makes sense because if you drive a car, you need to have a driver's license. And to get a driver's license, you have to go to the DMV and show that you can safely operate the vehicle and obey all the traffic laws. And so basically, coding interviews attempt to quantify problem-solving ability, and they attempt to do this as an overall proxy for in order to determine whether or not you are an effective engineer or not. But the trouble with this is that it only makes up the trouble with this is that it's a very difficult thing to quantify, and a very difficult thing to quantify consistently. And in addition, this is only one part of what makes someone an effective engineer. And so we can't discuss this without discussing how these things are broken. And so basically, they're not as accurate or as objective as people are led to believe. And just by way of example, one interviewer may expect you to write fully compilable C++ code on a whiteboard. Another one may expect you to write pseudocode and just kind of discuss your problem-solving strategy. Already there's some inconsistency here from interviewer to interviewer. And so, they're not reflective of what we do every day. I mean, my day-to-day consists of doing code reviews, submitting PRs, fixing bugs, and maybe an odd new feature here or there. It's not reflective of what I do every day. And so, according to TripleByte, which is one of these new coding screens as a service companies, coding interviews favor those that can devote time, study, energy, and practice to them. And it's one of those little dirty secrets where the skills that are used in an interview are so divergent from what we do every day that that preparing for them takes a lot of effort. And so because of this, there's now a booming cottage industry of tech interview preparation books, websites, services, etc. Now this one I thought was kind of interesting. Basically, an Airbnb host in Seattle is offering $4,600 for you to complete a mock Amazon interview with them. It seems kind of silly. Cracking the coding interview has long been the staple of people preparing for coding interviews. And in addition to that, there's a number of other websites and services that are out there that do double duty as both preparation services as well as screening services. And so to me, I feel like there's this conflict of interest there. And I'll take that a step further and say that I could probably write a whole talk just about that alone. I'm not saying you shouldn't prepare and study, but I feel like there's an upper limit to that. Interviewing.io is actually the interesting one here because they provide mock interviews and they collect a lot of data from those mock interviews. And they've actually come to some pretty startling conclusions. For example, outcomes are arbitrary and random. It's a surprise, right? And they've discovered that strong performers only do well 22% of the time. In addition to that, only 20% of people are consistent from interview to interview. And they've also discovered that coding interviews harm diversity and inclusion. I highly recommend that if you read one link, read this one. And it's a multifaceted problem that has to do with access to interview prep resources, the intuition to know that current tech interview practices are not the greatest, and the social support to stick with it and persevere despite of that. And the other part has to do with overcoming the confidence gap that someone may have. And so it's well known that they have a high false negative rate. And the thinking behind this is that it's better to turn away someone good than to hire someone bad. But what's interesting about this sentiment is that it seems to only apply to technical ability, not one's ability to communicate or to have empathy for what it is that you're doing. And so one of the reasons why these things have such a high false negative rate is because stress negatively impacts performance on highly cognitive tasks. I don't know about you, but I find programming to be pretty highly cognitive. And I know that if I was really stressed out by something, I'd have a hell of a time doing it. And so another problem is that the questions themselves are just way too difficult. You may be asking someone about this weird esoteric algorithm that you may have seen once and has absolutely no basis for what they're going to be doing every single day. So what are you gaining by asking them about this? And so the interviewers themselves often receive little or no training. And often the training that they receive only is, cover your rear type things, like, for example, questions you can't ask, like about marital status, plans to become pregnant, things like that. They don't focus on how to conduct a technical interview. They don't focus on unconscious bias. They don't focus on empathy. They don't focus on those things. And so coding interviews can also be very adversarial. And that's because there's this power dynamic, right? Interviewers will often poke at your solution under the guise of challenging you to think on your feet. And so what's interesting is these things become known as coding challenges. And that word challenge is important. And the reason why is because by adding that word challenge in there, you're implying that there's a level of distrust and hostility. And you're injecting that into what is already a very charged, stressful situation. And a lot of people seem to think that the only purpose of these things is to make the interviewer feel smart. And I'm definitely one of those. But believe it or not, this idea actually holds merit. According to this study that was published in Applied Psychology, interviewers who prefer brain teasers are more likely to be narcissistic, sadistic, socially inept, and callous. Think about it. I want to see how someone thinks under pressure. I want to see someone struggle with a problem. Think about what that says. You're delighting in the misery of someone else. And so one of the reasons for this is because it's difficult to empathize with someone once you've been in their shoes. If they had to overcome the same adversity as you or less, you're less likely to have empathy for them because you know what? I did it, so can they. And so another problem that comes out with this is that the technical skills that are evaluated take precedence over soft skills like empathy. And so this can give rise to the brilliant jerks problem. And probably one of the most famous examples is Linus Torvalds on Linux kernel mailing lists. I don't know about you, but I don't want Linus Torvalds reviewing my code. And so basically, coding interviews themselves are not psychologically safe. And according to a study that Google did about what makes teams effective, by far, psychological safety was one of the key enablers of high-performance teams. Say that in a coding interview and see what happens. And so the bottom line is, there is more to being a great engineer than coding. And so we have to discuss about what this has to do with mental health. And so it turns out there's quite a lot. So open sourcing mental illness is a mental health advocacy group for tech workers. And one of their activities every year is that they conduct an annual survey of mental health and things like that. And so I'm going to discuss some excerpts from their 2016 report because the 2017 and 2018 reports, for some reason, I was unable to retrieve the actual reports. The raw data was available, but I'm not a data scientist and I don't feel comfortable analyzing it to present to all of you. So we'll discuss the 2016 data. And so of 1,500 respondents to this survey, 42% affirmatively indicated that they have a mental health disorder. And so of those, 73% had a mood disorder like depression or bipolar. And in addition, 61% have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Now, those numbers add up interestingly, and the reason why is because mental health disorders frequently are comorbid, meaning that more than one diagnosis can exist at the same time in the same person. So someone can have depression and anxiety, anxiety and bipolar disorder, ADHD, things like that. And so according to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, approximately 25% of adults in the United States currently have a mental health issue. This is just to give some idea of the prevalence of all of this. And 50% will experience a mental health issue within their lifetime. 50%. And so we've discussed mental health, but we also have to discuss a little bit about imposter syndrome. Megan Bonchar, Boekshar, I'm sorry. She did an excellent presentation earlier this morning about imposter syndrome, enough that I was about to delete these slides, but I felt that it was important to continue. So I like the Wikipedia definition, which is it's a psychological phenomenon where people are unable to internalize their own accomplishments. And so some people think that this might be humble bragging, where, it wasn't that hard or whatever, something like that. But the thing is, that's not what it is. It often manifests itself as this irrational fear that you're going to be discovered or uncovered as a fraud, that you don't belong, that you're not good enough to do this. And so what's interesting is it's not actually a condition that's recognized by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. But just because of that, that doesn't mean that it can't exacerbate pre-existing conditions. So for example, if you have a back injury and you go on a roller coaster and the roller coaster aggravates it, you know, the roller coaster didn't cause it, but it certainly aggravated it. So imposter syndrome is the roller coaster in this case. And so for those that are mentally healthy, this can be just a minor annoyance. You know, think about whenever you start a new job for the first 3 to 6 months, especially if you're working in a new tech stack that you've never had any exposure to before. You may feel like you don't know anything. You're drinking from the fire hose, so to speak. But anyway, if you're mentally healthy, this can subside quickly, and a lot of people will use it as motivation to learn more and grow. But if you're not mentally healthy, it can be devastating. If you already have anxiety or depression and you find yourself in an insecure position like this, it can cause serious problems. And just to give some idea of how prevalent this is, 70% of adults, according to the International Journal of Behavioral Science, 20% of adults have experienced or will experience at least one episode of imposter syndrome within their lifetime. In addition to this, Blind, you know, the anonymous workplace app, whatever, they conducted a survey of tech workers, and approximately 58% of tech professionals reported having feelings of imposter syndrome, which is just astounding to me. And so what does this have to do with coding interviews? I know I talked a lot about these things, so we're going to kind of mesh them together a little bit now. So how many times have you seen this? How many times have you heard this when, you know, you get, you know, you're not a good fit, whatever? You know, don't take it personally. It's hard not to do that, isn't it? It really is, especially when you feel like, you know, you're an outsider in this industry and you feel like you might not belong. And so this is because we gain a lot of confidence in our ability to learn and apply skills. And over time, they become so much part of us that it becomes intrinsic to our identity. You know, it's one of those things that you know, kind of define who we are. Like, for example, I'm known for writing in Go and Python and things like that, and that's something that, you know, I've kind of taken. It's become part of my professional identity. And so when you're unable to apply one of those skills, it can really lead to a blow of self-confidence because it's so intrinsic to your identity that you've created. And so in a coding interview, you're expected to apply these things in what is an unnatural, stressful, and even sometimes hostile situation. And so because of this, people leave these interviews feeling frustrated, demoralized, like they don't belong. And so if you already have a mental illness of some sort, you may already be questioning your self-worth because of the unfortunate stigmas that already exist. And so imagine if you have anxiety or depression or something like that, and you go through a coding interview. At best, you're going to beat yourself up over it for days. And even if you pass the interview and get the job, you may feel like you're not good enough. And you're going to burn yourself out trying to make yourself good enough. You're going to work those long hours, and you're going to feel like you just don't belong. And so because of all this, there's a growing backlash against interviews like this. And one of the reasons why, and one of the ways that this happens is great people are self-excluding from interview processes because they just don't want to deal with it. And so, you know, I've talked a little bit about how these things kind of intertwine, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention a few ways that we can fix things. Now, many of these ideas that I'm going to suggest are surprisingly common sense. And some may be simple, some may not be. But I'm going to discuss ways that both companies and job seekers can find ways to help improve this process. So first of all, for companies, admit that it's broken. Don't just acknowledge that the process is bad or it's just the way it is, or, you know, we know it sucks, but there's nothing we can do about it. You know, too often people take pride in these processes as being rigorous, thorough, selective, grueling, extreme vetting, things like that. And there's no pride to be had in that. Provide formal training and practice. You know, focus on unconscious bias. Focus on how to conduct a technical interview. And also remember that interviewers, just like interviewees, need practice as well. So if you've been out of practice for a while, maybe do a couple mock interviews with your coworkers just to get an idea of, you know, just to get an idea of where your interview skills stand, things like that. And so if you're going to deploy a new screening method, like, for example, HackerRank, and I love to poke fun at them, test it anonymously amongst your staff. 3 things are likely to happen. 1, your staff are going to tell you that this is not a good idea. 2, some will just flat out refuse to do it. And 3, those that do, you're not going to have a 100% pass rate. And think about that for a minute. You know what your staff is capable of. And so you're asking them to take this test, and they failed the test. Think about what that means. That doesn't mean your staff is unskilled. That means that the test failed to produce a meaningful signal. And speaking of HackerRank, don't do it. It's essentially an automated whiteboard interview. And I've heard of cases where recruiters just blindly send out, "Hey, we'd love to talk to you, but first complete this test." You know, it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth when somebody does that. And in my mind, completing one of these things successfully only shows that you've done a number of practice problems with it. They have unrealistic time constraints, really bad tooling, really bad editors. The problems themselves are purposely obtuse, and they offer no opportunity for clarification or being able to ask questions about it. And so, enough to the point that I almost copy-pasted one up here just so I could turn and go, whack. And finally, they have hidden scoring that will just pass or fail you without any kind of feedback as to what you did wrong or what you needed to improve on. And that seems kind of disingenuous to me for an industry for an industry in practice that's ever evolving and promoting self-learning and things like self-learning and improvement. And so, if you're going to use a take-home test, and I'm not suggesting that you do. I'm not suggesting that at all. And the reason why is because that introduces a level of participation bias. A single parent is less able to do that than, say, someone that's a new grad. And so, if you're going to use one of these things, ideally, it should take no more than 2 hours to complete, and you can verify this by testing it against your current employees. And they will give you feedback as to whether it's a good example or not. If you do one of these, a 24 to 48 hour deadline is ridiculous. You're assuming that someone is just going to give up a vacation day or give up their weekends to complete your assessment. I don't know about you, but I don't like sitting at home on my computer on my weekends. And if someone uses one of these things, use it for if someone completes one of these things, use it for talking points. Don't throw it away. You have the code. Talk about it now. If you're doing like a DevOps or an SRE or sysadmin type interview, one should not have to depend on free quota from Google, AWS, or whomever just to do your take-home. You really should not have to do that. And finally, remember that talented people will have many of these to do, and they will prioritize accordingly. And so speaking of this, no coding with an audience. Why? Because it's a discrete skill that not everybody has. If you asked me to pop up in a text editor right here right now and code something, I'd probably look like a fool. But I recognize that one of the reasons why people like to see this is because they want to make sure that people aren't misrepresenting themselves. And cheating and misrepresentation unfortunately do occur. But I feel that this is a symptom of these bad processes rather than something that they're meant to weed out. So as these things get more and more difficult, people are more inclined to cheat or be dishonest or misrepresent themselves. Instead, ask them to do a code review for you. And this is not my idea. This came from Pete Holiday. He gave a talk at RailsConf 2018 last year, and there's actually a link here to his blog post about ways to kill the coding interview. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but his talk expands on this further, and the few key points are, how does somebody offer suggestions and improvements to this? How well do they communicate? And it shouldn't be like a bug hunt or explain this code type of thing. It should be, maybe you take that take home and you have them review it instead. Instead of writing it, you have them review it. Use structured rubrics. Identify what it is that you need for the job and get it on paper. This way it's consistent from interview to interview. So for example, if you decide that, okay, we need someone who knows how to use Docker, put it on the rubric, and then you can ask them questions about it, and it's more consistent that way. Limit your overall number of interviews. I've heard of cases where people had to complete, 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10 rounds of interviews. And is that really necessary to get a good hire, no hire signal? It's actually not, according to some study that Google did. According to that study also, by the way, the ideal number is 4. Value soft skills. Nobody wants to hire an arrogant and abrasive know-it-all. This is your opportunity to screen for it. And so in the face of someone who is very arrogant and abrasive but is a wizard coder, and someone who is able to communicate well but might not be the best coder, I'd rather have the second one. And the reason why is because tech can always be taught. And speaking of which, invest in skill growth. If you're finding that a lot of people don't quite have what you're looking for, train them yourself. A lot of companies are now starting up apprenticeship programs, and I remember this was a big theme at Hardifacts when I spoke there last year. Finally, provide more than 5 to 10 minutes for someone to ask you questions. They're about to sign it. If all goes well, that person is going to come work with you. They're making the decision in their life to come in and sit with you and work with you for I don't know how long, however they want. And so they probably have a bunch of questions that they would like to have answered as well. They're also actively interviewing you just the same as you are interviewing them. And 5 to 10 minutes is not enough time for them to have a good discussion about that. Collect and monitor statistics. Are you keeping track of how many people get through your interviews? Are you keeping track of why people didn't get through them? Are you keeping track of where those people ended up? If you're not keeping track of these things, how do you know that you're hiring the right people and not hiring the wrong ones? Ask for feedback. Ask your potential job seeker to rate their overall experience with the process and to rate each individual interviewer. And emphasize that their responses will not be seen until after a hire or no hire decision has been made. And so you can use this information to not only drive improvements in your process, but also generate accountability for the interviewers themselves. So that if Joe was a jerk to me in the interview, you now have that information and you can take corrective action. Be open and transparent about your process. It shouldn't be a surprise. GitLab and Medium actually do a very good job of this. If you go on their careers pages, it shows how many rounds of interviews you have to do, what those interviews look like. Are they whiteboarding, behavioral, technical deep dives, things like that. And it also describes the average latency for each stage of the pipeline and when people can expect to hear a decision one way or the other throughout each stage. And speaking of which, don't ghost people. With modern applicant tracking systems, where you put your resume in, there is no excuse, none, for not getting a response one way or the other. Resume black holes should not exist. And finally, be respectful. This one, I can't even believe I have to put this one up here, but I did. And the reason why is because if you're interviewing someone, they took time out of their life to come in and talk to you. They put their life on hold to make you their priority. Pay attention to them. Don't sit there and play with your phone. Don't sit there on your laptop typing away. I don't care if you're taking notes. Close the laptop and have the conversation. And if they're not doing well, if they're not answering your questions well, don't be a jerk. Don't be condescending. That does nothing. And for job seekers, I recognize many of the suggestions that I'm about to throw out here come from a place of privilege. And I understand that many of these, and I understand that not everyone is going to be able to do some of these things. And many of the actions I'm about to suggest have the consequence that you won't get the job. However, a large reason why tech interviewing is so traumatic and awful is because we've all acquiesced to this idea that it's awful. We know it's bad, but there's nothing we can do about it. But the reality is, you can. First of all, as a job seeker, you deserve respect. Just because you're just starting out in this industry, or just because you're a senior, apprentice, intern, senior, doesn't matter. You deserve respect, and you shouldn't tolerate someone disrespecting you, even in an interview. And if someone in an interview is being a jerk, being condescending, or just whatever, stand up and leave. Thank them for their time and walk out the door. if a company was disrespectful to you at some point, don't waste your time. And I've certainly rejected second chance interviews, as I like to call them, because they didn't treat me well the first time around. Ask about what the interview format is like what kind of interview, what's to be expected. Is it a whiteboarding interview? Is it live coding? Things like that. And if it's not the kind of interview you would feel comfortable with, politely decline and explain why. If they give you a take-home test that's going to take more than 2 hours of your time, politely decline, or better yet, ask to be paid. Because if you're going to take the time out of your life to do that, you should get paid for it. And the reason for this is because it's perfectly okay to have a life outside of work. And a prospective company asking you to invest a significant amount of time up front is, to me, a red flag about their culture. Send feedback about your experience. I remember one time I had a really bad experience, and 5 minutes after I clicked send on the email, my phone was ringing. No kidding. And finally, change from within. And this is the big one. Once you land that job, remember the process you had to go through to get there. At this point, you're not just a job seeker. You're now an employee. You have tremendous power at this point. You have the power and the responsibility to say, I had an awful experience interviewing. How do we fix this? Why are we doing this to people? And so, granted this, quote, applies more to misconduct than anything else, the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. And this applies to everyone, I feel. And so, remember, your interview process should do no harm. If you're making people feel exhausted, if you're grilling people, if you're, extreme vetting people, or mentioning this, it's not okay. There is no pride to be had in a process that delights in the misery of others. The goal of the interview is to have a conversation. And conversations, by the way, are full duplex. It's not just someone talking and asking questions. It's a full duplex, back and forth conversation. Not an interrogation, not a deposition, not a test. And finally, I want to say one thing to all of you. Each and every one of you in this room, without exception, you are all awesome, and you all deserve an amazing tech career. Now go forth and do good.